In the quiet town of Willow Creek, tech mogul Thomas Reed mourns over the coffin of his former lover Emily, unaware that her twin sons, Jalen and Darius, are watching him, their faces mirroring his own. A shocking revelation exposes his fatherhood, sparking a journey to right the wrongs of his past. As he struggles to gain the children's trust, Darius remains guarded and harbors a resentment, while Jalen opens up. Through shared moments and a heartfelt birthday, they forge a fragile bond, culminating in a profound graveside promise, a family reborn from loss, ready to face a hopeful future together. The autumn wind tore through Oakwood Cemetery in Willow Creek, Virginia, a mournful howl that carried the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Bare trees clawed at the gray sky, their skeletal branches swaying as if grieving alongside the small crowd gathered around an open casket. The air was heavy, not just with the chill of late October, but with the weight of loss that hung over every bowed head. At the edge of the gathering, a sleek black Bentley gleamed incongruously, its polished surface reflecting the somber scene like a dark mirror. Thomas Reed, its owner, stepped out, his tailored charcoal suit stark against the muted tones of the cemetery. His polished shoes sank slightly into the soft ground as he closed the car door with a muted thud, the sound swallowed by the wind. Thomas was no stranger to control. At 35, he had built a tech empire from nothing, his name synonymous with innovation and wealth in Washington, D.C.'s cutthroat business world. His sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes had graced magazine covers, his calculated decisions driving billion-dollar deals. But today, no amount of power could shield him from the raw ache in his chest. Emily Carter, the woman he had loved fiercely and lost 7 years ago, was gone. A sudden illness, cancer, the obituary had said, had stolen her in a matter of months. The news had reached him like a delayed explosion, shattering the carefully constructed walls of his life. He hadn't seen her since their bitter parting, when he'd chosen ambition over her, yet the wound of her absence had never fully healed. Now, standing in this small-town cemetery, 3 hours from his glittering penthouse, he felt like a man unmoored. The crowd was sparse, locals mostly, their faces etched with quiet sorrow. Thomas kept his distance, lingering near a gnarled oak tree, unwilling to intrude on their grief. His eyes, however, were fixed on the casket, a simple mahogany box adorned with white roses. Emily's favorite, he remembered, a detail that stabbed at him. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, drawn to her as if by some invisible thread. The mourners parted slightly, their murmurs fading as he approached, and there she was. Emily's face, serene and pale, lay against the satin lining, her blonde hair framing her like a halo. She looked almost as she had 7 years ago, when her laughter had filled their tiny DC apartment, when her green eyes had sparkled with dreams of a shared future. But now those eyes were closed forever, and the sight broke something in Thomas. His knees buckled, and he sank to the ground, his hands gripping the casket's edge as sobs tore from his throat. "Emily," he whispered, the word a plea, a confession, a regret. "I'm so sorry." Unseen by Thomas, two small figures watched from a cluster of headstones a few rows away. Jalen and Darius, 6-year-old twins, stood hand in hand, their deep brown skin contrasting with the ill-fitting black suits they wore. Their mother, Emily, a white woman who had raised them alone in Willow Creek, had taught them to ignore the whispers about their mixed heritage, to hold their heads high. Today, though, their small shoulders slumped, their eyes red from crying. They had slipped away from their guardian, Miss Clara, wanting one last moment with their mom. Jalen, the bolder of the two, tugged at Darius's sleeve, pointing toward the man weeping at the casket. "Who's that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Darius, quieter and more guarded, squinted, his breath catching. The man's face, pale, angular, with high cheekbones and a strong jaw, was like looking into a strange, distorted mirror. "He looks like us," Darius murmured, confusion knitting his brow. Before Jalen could respond, a firm hand gripped their shoulders. Miss Clara, a stout black woman in her 60s with a no-nonsense air, loomed over them. Her dark eyes flicked to Thomas, narrowing with a mix of recognition and suspicion. Clara had been Emily's neighbor, her confidant, the one who'd held her hand through sleepless nights and hospital visits. She knew exactly who Thomas Reed was and what he'd done. "You two stay away from that man," she said, her voice low but sharp, like a blade cutting through the wind. "Come on now." She steered the boys toward the cemetery's rusted iron gates, her grip unyielding. Jalen glanced back, curious, but Darius's gaze lingered on Thomas, a storm of questions brewing in his young mind. Thomas, lost in his grief, didn't notice the boys or Clara's hasty retreat. His hands trembled as he traced the edge of the casket, memories flooding him. He saw Emily smile as they danced in their cramped apartment, her voice teasing him about his relentless work ethic. He saw the night she left, her note on the kitchen counter. "I can't compete with your dreams, Thomas. I hope they're worth it." He had let her go, convinced he was building a future for them both, too proud to chase her. Now that pride tasted like ash. He had no idea she'd return to Willow Creek, no idea she'd face life alone, no idea what she'd endured in her final days. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing against his ribs, making each breath a struggle. The minister's voice broke through his haze, calling for the final prayer. Thomas stood, wiping his face with a trembling hand, his suit now streaked with dirt. As the crowd began to disperse, he lingered, unable to tear himself away. The white roses on the casket trembled in the wind, and he reached out, plucking one and holding it to his chest. "I should have been here," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I should have fought for you." Behind him, the cemetery grew quiet, the last mourners fading into the dusk. Jalen and Darius were gone, whisked away by Clara, but their faces, those hauntingly familiar faces, had burned themselves into the edges of Thomas's mind, though he didn't yet know why. As he turned back to his Bentley, the rose still clutched in his hand, a single thought crystallized. He needed answers. About Emily, about her life, about the boys he'd seen. The wind howled again, carrying his resolve into the gathering dark, a promise to uncover the truth, no matter the cost. The flickering light of a single lamp cast long shadows across Miss Clara's modest parlor in Willow Creek, Virginia. The room, with its faded floral wallpaper and worn mahogany furniture, smelled faintly of lavender and old books, a testament to Clara's years as Emily Carter's neighbor and confidant. Thomas Reed sat stiffly on the edge of a threadbare sofa, his tailored suit out of place in the cozy, lived-in space. His hands, usually steady in boardrooms, clenched and unclenched on his knees, betraying the storm raging within. Across from him, Clara sat in a high-backed chair, her dark eyes piercing through him like a judge weighing a verdict. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, the ticking of a grandfather clock, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. It had taken Thomas hours to track Clara down after the funeral. The image of the twin boys, Jalen and Darius, haunted him, their faces a mirror of his own. Though framed by deep brown skin that spoke of Emily's courage in raising them alone in a small, judgmental town. He'd seen them at the cemetery, their small figures trembling as they stood near Emily's casket, and the shock of their resemblance had rooted him to the spot. Clara's swift intervention, pulling them away with a glare that could cut glass, had only deepened his need for answers. Now, sitting in her home, he felt like a man standing at the edge of a precipice, about to learn a truth that could unravel everything. "Mr. Reed," Clara began, her voice low and measured, "you've got no business here. Those boys don't know you, and I ain't sure they should." Her words were a wall, built from years of protecting Emily and her sons. Thomas leaned forward, his blue eyes intense, searching her face for any crack in her resolve. "Clara, please," he said, his voice raw from the tears he'd shed at the grave. "I saw them, Jalen and Darius. They look like me. I need to know who they are to Emily. To me." Clara's lips tightened, her hands folding tightly in her lap. She'd known this moment would come, had dreaded it since Emily's final days when the truth had spilled out in a hospital room heavy with the scent of antiseptic. Emily had made her swear to keep the secret, to shield the boys from a father who'd chosen ambition over love. But now, with Thomas sitting before her, his grief palpable, Clara felt the weight of that promise shift. She studied him, the sharp lines of his face, the expensive watch glinting on his wrist. the man who'd built a tech empire while Emily worked herself to death. Could he be trusted with the truth? After a long, agonizing pause, Claire exhaled, her shoulders sagging slightly. "They're Emily's sons," she said, her tone clipped. "Jalen and Darius, 6 years old, born right here in Willow Creek after she left you." Thomas's breath hitched, his mind racing to piece together the timeline. 7 years ago, he and Emily had parted ways in D.C., their love crumbling under the weight of his relentless drive. She'd left without a word beyond a note, and he'd let her go, too consumed by his startup to chase her. Now the math was undeniable, but he needed to hear it. "Are they mine?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, each word trembling with hope and dread. Clara's gaze hardened, but there was a flicker of pity in her eyes. "Emily told me everything before she passed," she said. "When you told her you wanted to focus on your career, she was already pregnant. Didn't know it till after she left D.C. She came back here, to her hometown, because she couldn't bear to stay near you, knowing you'd chosen work over her. She raised those boys alone, Thomas. Worked 2 jobs, waitressing, cleaning houses, while painting on the side to keep their spirits up. Never asked for a dime from anyone, especially not you. But it wore her down. Cancer came fast, and by the time they found it, she was too far gone." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow, each one a shard of glass slicing through his carefully constructed world. He pressed a hand to his chest as if to hold himself together, his face paling to a ghostly white. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I swear, Clara, I didn't know she was pregnant. I thought she'd moved on, built a new life." The truth was worse than any regret he'd carried. While he'd been closing deals in skyscrapers, Emily had been scraping by, pouring her life into their sons, his sons, until her body gave out. The guilt was suffocating, a vice around his heart. Clara watched him, her expression unyielding but not cruel. "She didn't tell you because she was proud," she said, "and because she was afraid. Afraid you'd disappoint those boys the way you disappointed her. She wanted them to have a father who'd be there, not one who'd put money first." Thomas flinched, the accusation stinging because it was true. He'd been that man 7 years ago, blind to what mattered until it was gone. But the thought of Jalen and Darius growing up without him, believing they were unwanted, was unbearable. "They're my sons," he said, more to himself than to Clara, the realization settling like a stone in his gut. "I have to make this right." Clara leaned forward, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "Those boys just lost their mama, the only person who ever showed up for them. They don't need a stranger waltzing in with promises he might not keep. You want to make it right? Prove you're more than the man who walked away from Emily." Her words were a challenge, a gauntlet thrown at his feet. Thomas met her gaze, his jaw tightening with resolve. "I will," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. "I'll do whatever it takes." The grandfather clock chimed, marking the late hour, but neither moved. Clara studied him, weighing his sincerity against the pain Emily had endured. Finally, she sighed, a sound heavy with resignation. "I ain't promising you anything," she said, "but I'll think on it. Those boys are my responsibility now, and I won't let them get hurt. You come back tomorrow and we'll talk. But don't you dare show up with empty words." Thomas nodded, his throat too tight to speak. He stood, his movements slow, as if the weight of the truth had aged him in minutes. As he stepped into the cool night, the stars hidden behind a veil of clouds, Thomas clutched the white rose from Emily's casket, its petals bruised but still soft. The revelation burned in his chest. He was a father, and his sons were strangers who didn't even know his name. The drive back to his rented apartment was a blur, the road stretching endlessly before him. In the silence of his car, he made a vow. To Emily, to Jalen, to Darius, and himself. He would not be the man who walked away again. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Thomas Reed felt a purpose beyond wealth, a chance to reclaim what he'd lost, one painful step at a time. The early November dawn painted Willow Creek in hues of frost and amber, the small town stirring slowly under a sky streaked with clouds. Thomas Reed stood outside his rented apartment, a modest brick building on the edge of Main Street, his breath visible in the crisp air. His sleek Bentley, parked incongruously among pickup trucks and minivans, gleamed under the streetlights. Sleep had eluded him. The weight of Clara's revelation, Jalen and Darius, his 6-year-old twin sons, pressing against his mind like a stone. He'd spent the night replaying every moment of his past with Emily, each memory a fresh wound. Now, as the sun crept over the horizon, he steeled himself for the day ahead. Clara had agreed to meet again, but her warning echoed. Prove you're more than the man who walked away. Today, he would take the first step. Clara's house, a squat, white-painted cottage with a sagging porch, stood a mile away. Thomas drove slowly, the town's quiet streets a stark contrast to DC's frenetic pulse. He parked a block from Clara's, not wanting to draw attention, and walked the rest, his tailored coat doing little to shield him from the morning chill. His polished shoes clicked against the uneven sidewalk, each step a reminder of how out of place he was in this world Emily had chosen for their sons. At the door he hesitated, the white rose from her casket still tucked in his pocket, its petals now brittle. He knocked, the sound sharp in the stillness. Clara answered, her face as stern as it had been the night before. She wore a navy cardigan, her gray hair pulled into a tight bun, and her eyes assessed him with the precision of a hawk. "You're early," she said, stepping aside to let him in. The parlor was unchanged, the air still tinged with lavender, but now the faint sound of children's voices drifted from the back of the house. Thomas's heart lurched. Jalen and Darius were here, somewhere beyond the walls, unaware of the man who'd fathered them. Clara gestured to the same sofa, her expression unyielding. "Sit. We've got things to settle." Thomas lowered himself onto the cushion, his hands clasped tightly. "I meant what I said last night," he began, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "I want to be in their lives. I'll do whatever you ask, Clara. Just let me start somewhere." Clara's lips pursed, her fingers drumming on the arm of her chair. She'd spent years watching Emily pour her soul into those boys, shielding them from a world that often stared at their mixed heritage. The thought of letting Thomas, a man who'd abandoned Emily, near them, was a risk she wasn't sure she could take. But there was something in his eyes, a raw desperation that hadn't been there when Emily had spoken of him years ago. "You don't just waltz into a child's life," she said, her voice low. "Those boys are grieving. They don't need promises that might break." Thomas nodded, swallowing the sting of her words. "I know I don't deserve their trust, or yours, but I'm not here to disrupt their lives. I want to help, to be there for them, even if it's small at first." He leaned forward, his blue eyes pleading. "Let me do something. Pay for their school supplies, drive them to school, anything. I'll follow your rules." Clara studied him, her silence stretching like a taut wire. Finally she sighed, a sound heavy with reluctance. "No money," she said firmly. "Emily never took handouts, and I won't start now. But I'll let you drive them to school, twice a week, starting tomorrow. You show up late, you miss a day, or you upset them, and it's over. Understand?" Relief flooded Thomas, though it was tempered by the weight of her conditions. "I understand," he said, his voice thick. "Thank you, Clara." She held up a hand, cutting him off. "Don't thank me yet. I'm watching you, Thomas Reed. One wrong move, and you're gone." Before he could respond, a clatter from the hallway drew their attention. Two small figures appeared at the parlor's threshold, their dark eyes wide with curiosity. Jalen, the bolder twin, stood slightly ahead, his hair a mess of tight curls, while Darius lingered behind, his gaze wary. Thomas's breath caught. Their faces, a blend of his sharp features and Emily's softness, were even more striking up close. Clara's voice softened as she addressed the boys. "Jalen, Darius, this is Mr. Thomas. He's going to drive you to school sometimes. Say hello." Jalen tilted his head, sizing Thomas up. "You got that fancy car outside?" he asked, a spark of interest in his voice. Thomas managed a small smile, his heart pounding. "Yeah, that's mine. You like cars?" Jalen nodded enthusiastically, but Darius stayed silent, his arms crossed, his eyes flicking between Thomas and Clara, as if searching for a trap. "Why are you here?" Darius asked, his voice quiet but sharp, cutting through the room like a blade. Thomas froze, the question catching him off guard. He wanted to tell them everything. that he was their father, that he'd love their mother, that he'd spend the rest of his life making up for lost time. But Clara's warning glance stopped him. "I knew your mom," he said carefully, his voice gentle. "She was special. I want to help you and Miss Clara, if you'll let me." Darius's expression didn't soften, but Jalen's curiosity seemed to win out. "Mom liked shiny things," he said almost to himself. "She'd probably like your car." The mention of Emily twisted something in Thomas's chest, but he clung to the moment, desperate to keep the connection alive. Clara stood, signaling the conversation's end. "All right, boys, go get your backpacks. You're going to school soon." As they scampered off, she turned to Thomas, her voice low. "They don't know who you are, and I ain't ready to tell them. You earned that right, you hear?" Thomas nodded, standing as well. "I will," he promised, the words a vow to himself as much as to her. The next morning, Thomas pulled up to Clara's house at 7 a.m. Sharp, his Bentley idling quietly. Jalen and Darius emerged, backpacks slung over their shoulders, Clara watching from the porch like a sentinel. Jalen climbed into the back seat with a grin, immediately pressing his face to the window to admire the car's sleek interior. Darius slid in more slowly, his expression guarded, buckling himself in without a word. Thomas glanced at them in the rearview mirror, his heart aching at their proximity, yet feeling the chasm between them. "Ready for school?" he asked, keeping his tone light. Jalen nodded, launching into a story about his favorite superhero show, but Darius stared out the window, his silence louder than any words. The drive to Willow Creek Elementary was short, the town's streets lined with oak trees shedding their last leaves. Thomas tried to make small talk, mentioning the superhero show Clara had told him the boys loved. Jalen lit up, describing a recent episode, but Darius muttered, "You don't know us," his voice barely audible. The words stung, but Thomas absorbed them, knowing trust would take time. As they pulled up to the school, Jalen hopped out, waving a quick goodbye, while Darius lingered, his eyes meeting Thomas's in the mirror for a fleeting moment. "Thanks," he mumbled, then hurried after his brother. Thomas watched them disappear into the crowd of children, their laughter echoing as they joined their friends. The school's bell rang, a sharp reminder of the life he'd missed. Mornings like this, small moments that built a family. He gripped the steering wheel, the white rose still in his pocket, its thorns pricking through the fabric. This was just the beginning, a fragile foothold in a world he'd unknowingly abandoned. As he drove back to his apartment, the road ahead felt both daunting and sacred, each mile a chance to prove he could be the father Jalen and Darius deserved. The winter sun hung low over Willow Creek, casting long shadows across the frost-dusted streets as Thomas Reed navigated his Bentley toward Clara's cottage. It was mid-December, 6 weeks since he'd first learned of his sons, Jalen and Darius, and each day had been a delicate dance of persistence and restraint. The town, with its quaint storefronts and bare oak trees, had become a second home, a far cry from the glass and steel world of D.C., where Thomas had built his tech empire. His rented apartment, once a temporary foothold, now held traces of his new purpose. Photos of Emily, a dog-eared superhero comic for Jalen, a sketchpad for Darius. Today he carried 2 small gifts in his coat pocket, their weight a quiet promise to the boys he was determined to know. Clara had allowed him to drive Jalen and Darius to school twice a week, a grudging concession that felt like a lifeline. Those brief rides, filled with Jalen's chatter and Darius's guarded silence, were precious, but Thomas craved more. He'd spent sleepless nights researching parenting, memorizing details Clara shared about the boys' likes and dislikes, desperate to bridge the gap between stranger and father. Yesterday, he'd proposed a bold step, let the boys visit his D.C. mansion for a day. Clara had hesitated, her dark eyes searching his face for cracks in his resolve. "They're starting to get used to you," she'd said, her voice a mix of warning and reluctant approval. "But don't push too hard. They're still fragile." After a tense pause, she'd agreed, setting strict rules. No extravagant gifts, no talk of the past, and she'd be there to supervise. Now, as Thomas pulled up to Clara's house, the morning air was sharp with the promise of snow. Jalen and Darius bounded out, their breath puffing in clouds, backpacks bouncing. Jalen, ever the spark, grinned at Bentley, his curls peeking from under a red beanie. "We're going to your big house today, right?" he asked, climbing into the back seat. Darius followed, his expression a fortress, though his eyes flicked curiously to Thomas. "Yeah," Thomas replied, keeping his tone light. "It's got a game room you might like." Jalen's face lit up, but Darius only shrugged, buckling himself in with deliberate care. Clara emerged last, her navy coat buttoned to the chin, her presence a reminder of the trust Thomas had yet to fully earn. The drive to D.C. was a 2-hour journey, the highway stretching through fields dusted with frost. Jalen filled the silence with stories of schoolyard soccer games, his voice bubbling with energy. Thomas seized the chance to connect, asking about his favorite players, earning a gleeful rant about Messi. Darius, however, stared out the window, his sketch pad clutched to his chest. Thomas glanced at him in the rearview mirror, searching for an opening. "You draw a lot, Darius?" he asked gently. The boy's shoulders tensed, but after a beat he nodded. "Yeah, mostly superheroes." It was a small crack in his armor, and Thomas tucked it away, vowing to nurture it. The mansion loomed into view as they entered D.C.'s affluent suburbs, its modern facade of glass and stone, a stark contrast to Willow Creek's humility. Jalen's jaw dropped as they pulled into the driveway. "This is huge!" he exclaimed, scrambling out. Darius's eyes widened, but his lips pressed into a thin line, as if measuring the wealth against memories of their mother's struggles. Clara's gaze was unreadable, though her hand rested protectively on Darius's shoulder. Inside, the mansion's polished floors and soaring ceilings echoed with emptiness, a monument to Thomas's solitary success. He led them to the game room, where a pool table, arcade machines, and a massive TV awaited. Jalen dove in, challenging Clara to air hockey, his laughter bouncing off the walls. Darius, however, wandered to a floor-to-ceiling window, his sketchpad open, pencil moving across the page as he captured the city skyline. Thomas approached cautiously, crouching beside him. "That's good," he said, nodding at the detailed sketch of a skyscraper. "You've got a real talent." Darius glanced up, his dark eyes searching Thomas's face for sincerity. "Mom used to say that," he murmured, then looked away, his pencil pausing. The mention of Emily was a knife to Thomas's heart, but he seized the moment. "Your mom was incredible," he said softly. "She worked so hard for you both. I wish I'd been there to help." Darius's jaw tightened, and for a moment Thomas feared he'd said too much. But then Darius resumed sketching, a silent acknowledgement that kept the fragile thread between them intact. Lunch was pizza in the kitchen, a deliberate choice to keep things familiar. Jalen chattered about the arcade games, while Clara watched Thomas with a mix of scrutiny and curiosity. After eating, Thomas pulled the gifts from his pocket. A soccer ball for Jalen, embossed with his favorite team's logo, and a set of charcoal pencils for Darius, recommended by an art store clerk. "Just something small," Thomas said, handing them over. Jalen's grin was instant, but Darius hesitated, his fingers tracing the pencil's case. "Thanks," he said quietly, the word carrying a weight Thomas felt in his bones. As the day wound down, Clara called the boys to gather their things. Jalen hugged Thomas impulsively, his enthusiasm a balm to Thomas's nerves. Darius hung back, clutching his sketch pad, but his nod was less guarded than before. In the car, Clara broke the silence. "They had a good time," she said, her tone measured. "They're starting to like you, Thomas. But don't forget, they've lost too much to lose you too." Thomas met her gaze in the mirror, his resolve hardening. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, the words of vow etched into his soul. Back in Willow Creek, as the boys disappeared into Clara's house, Thomas lingered in the driveway, the mansion's opulence fading from his mind. He pulled the white rose from his pocket, its petals crumbling, but still fragrant. Today had been a step forward, small, tentative, but real. Jalen's laughter, Darius's quiet acceptance of the pencils, Clara's reluctant approval, they were threads in a tapestry he was only beginning to weave. The road to fatherhood was fraught with shadows of his past mistakes, but for the first time, Thomas felt the flicker of hope. He would return tomorrow, and the next day, and every day after, until the boys knew they were his world. As snow began to fall, dusting the town in silence. Thomas drove into the night, carrying the weight of his son's trust and the promise to earn it, one careful moment at a time. The spring sun blazed over the sprawling amusement park on the outskirts of Richmond, Virginia, its golden rays glinting off roller coasters and the shimmering surface of a lazy river. Laughter and screams of delight filled the air, mingling with the sugary scent of cotton candy and the rhythmic clatter of rides. Thomas Reed stood at the park's heart, his usual tailored suit replaced by a casual navy polo and jeans, a rare concession to the day's warmth and the boys he was desperate to connect with. Jalen and Darius, his 6-year-old twin sons, darted ahead, their dark curls bouncing as they chased each other through a maze of colorful stalls. Their joy was a beacon, pulling Thomas from the shadows of his guilt. But beneath his smile lay a churning resolve. Today he would tell them the truth, that he was their father, a revelation that could either bind them or shatter the fragile trust he'd spent months building. The past weeks had been a slow climb. Clara, the boy's guardian, had softened, allowing Thomas to take Jalen and Darius on outings beyond school runs, soccer games, ice cream trips, even a sleepover at his DC mansion. Jalen, with his boundless energy, had warmed to Thomas, his chatter filling the silences with stories of school and superheroes. Darius, however, remained a fortress, his dark eyes guarded, though he'd begun sharing his sketches, a quiet offering Thomas cherished. Clara's warning still echoed, "Don't push too hard," but the weight of the secret, that he was their father, unknown to them, had grown unbearable. He couldn't keep pretending to be just Mr. Thomas, not when every glance in their faces, a blend of his features and Emily's strength, reminded him of what he'd missed. The park was a calculated choice, a place of joy where the boys could feel safe, yet its chaos mirrored Thomas's inner turmoil. Jalen tugged at his hand, pointing to the bumper cars. "Come on, Mr. Thomas, let's crash," he shouted, his grin infectious. Darius, clutching a half-eaten pretzel, followed, his expression softer than usual. Thomas joined them, squeezing into a neon green car, the jolts and laughter loosening the knot in his chest. For an hour they roamed, riding the Ferris wheel, where Jalen whooped at the view, and playing ring toss, where Darius's steady aim won a stuffed dragon. Thomas watched them, his heart swelling, knowing this moment of ease was the calm before the storm. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Thomas led the boys to a quiet bench overlooking a glittering river that bordered the park. The water sparkled, catching the last light, and a gentle breeze carried the distant hum of the park. Jalen munched on cotton candy, his face sticky, while Darius sat cross-legged, sketching the river's curve. Thomas's hands trembled as he sat between them, the weight of his words pressing against his throat. "Boys," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "there's something important I need to tell you." Jalen looked up, curious, his cotton candy forgotten. Darius's pencil paused, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if sensing a shift. Thomas took a deep breath, the river's shimmer grounding him. "I'm not just someone who knew your mom," he said, his gaze moving between them. I'm your dad." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw, like a stone dropped into still water. Jalen's eyes widened, a smile flickering. "Really? Like our real dad?" he asked, his voice a mix of awe and excitement. But Darius's face darkened, his small fists clenching, the sketchpad sliding to the bench. "You left Mom," Darius spat, his voice sharp and trembling, cutting through the park's distant noise. "She worked so hard, got sick, and you weren't there." The accusation was a blade, slicing into Thomas's heart. Before he could respond, Darius bolted, his small figure sprinting toward a grassy hill by the river, his sneakers pounding the earth. Jalen's face crumpled, torn between his brother and the man he'd begun to trust. "Darius!" he called, scrambling after him. Thomas followed, his pulse racing, the world narrowing to the boy who carried his pain like a shield. The hill sloped gently to the river's edge, where the grass glowed emerald under the fading light. Darius sat curled up, his knees to his chest, tears streaming down his face. The stuffed dragon clutched tightly. Jalen reached him first, dropping to his side, his hand on his brother's shoulder. "Don't be mad," Jalen whispered, his voice small. Thomas approached slowly, his chest tight, crouching a few feet away to give Darius space. The river lapped softly, a counterpoint to the storm in Darius's eyes. "I'm so sorry," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know about you, Darius. I didn't know your mom was pregnant when she left. If I had, I swear I would have been there." Darius's sobs grew louder, his words spilling out in a torrent. "Mom cried at night," he said, his voice raw. "She worked all day, cleaned houses, and still made us dinner. She was so tired and you were nowhere. She got sick and we couldn't help her." The images pierced Thomas. Emily, exhausted, hiding her tears, sacrificing everything for their sons while he built his empire in blissful ignorance. He wanted to pull Darius into his arms, to shield him from the pain, but he knew words were all he had now. "You're right," he said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "I wasn't there, and nothing can change that. But I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere. I want to be your dad, if you'll let me." Jalen, his eyes wide, looked between them, his hand still on Darius's shoulder. "He's been nice to us," he said softly. Maybe he means it." Darius shook his head, wiping his face roughly, but his sobs slowed. He looked at Thomas, his gaze a battlefield of anger and longing. "Why now?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Thomas leaned closer, his heart laid bare. "Because the moment I saw you at the cemetery, I knew you were mine, and I knew I'd spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." The river's shimmer faded as dusk settled, the park's lights twinkling in the distance. Darius unclenched his fist, his shoulders slumping, the fight draining from him. He didn't speak, but he didn't run either, a fragile truce in the silence. Jalen, sensing the shift, picked up the stuffed dragon and handed it to Thomas. "You keep it," he said, a small gesture of trust. Thomas took it, his throat tight, and nodded. "Let's head back," he said gently. "It's getting late." As they walked to the car, Jalen slipped his hand into Thomas's, his warmth a lifeline. Darius trailed behind, his sketch pad under his arm, but his steps were less heavy. The truth had been laid bare, a wound exposed to the air, and though it stung, it was the first step toward healing. Thomas glanced at the river, its surface now dark, and felt the weight of the rose in his pocket. Emily's rose, a reminder of the love he'd lost and the sons he'd found. The drive home was quiet, the boys' faces lit by passing streetlights, and Thomas knew the road ahead would be steep. But for the first time, he felt the possibility of a family, forged in pain, but held together by a promise he would never break. The late spring air in Willow Creek carried the scent of blooming dogwoods and freshly cut grass, a gentle warmth settling over the town as May unfurled. Thomas Reed stood in the driveway of Clara's cottage, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jeans, the casual attire still foreign to a man accustomed to boardroom suits. The Bentley idled behind him, its sleek lines a stark contrast to the town's modest charm. 3 weeks had passed since the amusement park, since he'd dropped the bombshell that he was Jalen and Darius's father, and the aftermath lingered like a bruise. Jalen, with his open heart, had begun to embrace Thomas, his smiles a flicker of light in the darkness. But Darius, guarded and wounded, had retreated further, his anger a wall Thomas couldn't yet breach. Today, Clara had agreed to a sleepover at his D.C. mansion, a significant step, but one fraught with the risk of pushing Darius too far. The revelation at the park had shifted everything. Jalen's tentative acceptance had been a lifeline, his chatter now peppered with "Mr. Thomas" and shy questions about his life. Darius, however, had grown quieter, his sketches darker, filled with jagged lines and shadowed figures. Clara, ever the sentinel, had watched Thomas closely, her approval grudging but growing. "You're trying," she told him last week, her voice softer than before. "But Darius carries his mama's pain. You gotta be patient." Patience was a skill Thomas had never mastered, but for his sons he was learning, one painstaking moment at a time. The cottage door swung open and Jalen bounded out, his backpack bouncing, a soccer ball tucked under his arm. "Ready for the big house," he called, his grin infectious. Darius followed, his sketch pad clutched to his chest, his eyes fixed on the ground. Clara emerged last, her navy cardigan swapped for a lighter jacket, her gaze sweeping over Thomas like a lighthouse beam. "You keep them safe," she said, her tone a mix of trust and warning. "And don't let Darius feel cornered." Thomas nodded, his throat tight. "I won't," he promised, opening the car door for the boys. The drive to D.C. was a study in contrast. Jalen filled the silence with a play-by-play of his latest soccer game, his hands gesturing wildly. Thomas seized the chance to connect, asking about his favorite moves, earning a detailed breakdown of a goal he'd scored. Darius, however, sat statue still, his sketch pad open but untouched, his eyes tracing the passing fields. Thomas glanced at him in the rearview mirror, searching for an inroad. "Got any new drawings, Darius?" he asked, keeping his voice light. Darius's fingers tightened on the pad, but after a beat he muttered, "Not yet." It was a small response, but Thomas clung to it, a crack in the wall. The mansion's grandeur hit Jalen like a wave as they arrived, his eyes wide as he raced through the foyer, marveling at the chandelier's sparkle. Thomas had spent the week transforming a guest room for the boys. Bunk beds with superhero bedding, a shelf of comics for Jalen, and an art desk for Darius. Jalen whooped, claiming the top bunk, while Darius lingered by the desk, his fingers brushing the new charcoal pencils Thomas had added. "This for me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Thomas nodded, crouching to his level. "Thought you might like a spot to draw." Darius's eyes met his, a flicker of something, gratitude perhaps, before he looked away, nodding silently. Dinner was takeout pizza, eaten around the kitchen island to keep things familiar. Jalen chattered about school, while Darius picked at his slice, his gaze distant. Clara, who joined them for the evening, watched the dynamic, her presence a steady anchor. After dinner, Thomas suggested a movie in the home theater, letting Jalen pick a superhero flick. Jalen sprawled on a beanbag, cheering at the action, while Darius sat apart, sketching by the screen's glow. Thomas sat nearby, not pushing, but close enough to show he was there. Halfway through, Darius slid his sketch pad toward him, revealing a drawing of a hero in a storm, the lines fierce but precise. "That's amazing," Thomas said, his voice genuine. Darius shrugged, but a ghost of a smile touched his lips, a moment of connection that felt like a victory. Bedtime brought a new challenge. As Thomas tucked Jalen in, the boy whispered, "I like it here, Mr. Thomas. You're kinda cool." The words warmed Thomas's heart, but Darius, already in the bottom bunk, turned away, his silence deafening. Thomas hesitated, then sat on the floor beside him. "Darius," he said softly, "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. I just want you to know I'm here whenever you're ready." Darius didn't respond, but his breathing slowed, a sign he was listening. Thomas left the room, the weight of that silence heavy on his shoulders. The next morning, Thomas drove the boys to a soccer game in Willow Creek, and Clara met them at the field. Jalen ran onto the pitch, waving at Thomas, who cheered from the sidelines, his voice hoarse by halftime. Darius sat on the bleachers, sketching the players, but Thomas noticed him glance up whenever Jalen scored, a quiet pride in his eyes. After the game, Thomas joined a parent-teacher conference Clara had arranged, learning about Jalen's knack for leadership and Darius's talent for art, his drawings earning praise from his teacher. The details were treasures, each one a piece of the puzzle Thomas was assembling. Back at Clara's, as the boys disappeared inside, Clara pulled Thomas aside. "You're getting through to them," she said, her tone less guarded. "Jalen's halfway there. But Darius, he's testing you. He needs to know you won't leave." Thomas nodded, the stuffed dragon from the amusement park still in his car, a reminder of that pivotal day. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice firm. Clara studied him, then gave a small nod, a gesture of trust that felt hard-won. As Thomas drove back to his apartment, the town's streets quiet under the midday sun. He felt the fragility of the bond he was building. Jalen's warmth was a gift, but Darius's hesitation was a challenge he couldn't rush. The rose from Emily's casket, now pressed in a book on his nightstand, was a talisman of his commitment. He'd missed 6 years, but he wouldn't miss another day. The mansion, once a symbol of his solitude, was starting to feel like a home, its walls waiting for the laughter and sketches of his sons. As he parked, a text from Clara buzzed. Darius kept the pencils. That's something. Thomas smiled, a spark of hope igniting. The bond was fragile, but it was growing, rooted in patience and the promise of a father who would never walk away again. The July sun bathed Thomas Reed's DC mansion in a golden glow, its glass walls reflecting the vibrant energy of a day unlike any other. Inside, the sprawling home buzzed with preparations, transformed into a wonderland of blue and red balloons, streamers cascading from the chandelier, and a bounce house looming in the backyard. Today was Jalen and Darius's 7th birthday, their first without their mother, Emily, and Thomas had poured his heart into making it unforgettable. The kitchen counter, usually pristine, was dusted with flour, the air thick with the rich aroma of chocolate cake baking in the oven. A recipe Clara had shared, one Emily had made every year for her boys. Thomas, in a rare apron over his jeans, wiped sweat from his brow, his hands trembling not from the heat, but from the weight of the moment. This was more than a party. It was a promise, a vow to be the father he'd failed to be for 6 years. The past months had been a delicate tightrope walk. Since revealing he was their father at the amusement park, Thomas had navigated Jalen's growing warmth and Darius's lingering wariness. Jalen now called him Mr. Thomas with a grin, his soccer games and sleepovers at the mansion filled with laughter. Darius, though, remained a puzzle, his sketches a window into his guarded heart, his trust offered in fleeting moments, like when he'd shown Thomas a drawing of a superhero last week, asking for his opinion. Clara, their guardian, had become an unexpected ally, her skepticism softening as Thomas proved his commitment. This birthday's gonna hurt them, she'd warned, handing over Emily's recipe. Make it about them, not your guilt. Thomas had nodded, determined to honor Emily's memory while building a future with his sons. The doorbell chimed, pulling Thomas from his thoughts. Jalen and Darius burst in, their backpacks slung carelessly, followed by Clara, her eyes scanning the decorations with cautious approval. Jalen's face lit up, his curls bouncing as he spotted the bounce house. Whoa! Is that for us? He shouted, already kicking off his sneakers. Darius hung back, his sketchpad under his arm, but his gaze softened at the sight of a banner reading, Happy 7th Birthday, Jalen and Darius. It's all for you, Thomas said, crouching to their level, his voice warm but tinged with nerves. Jalen hugged him impulsively, while Darius offered a small nod, a gesture Thomas had learned to cherish. The afternoon unfolded in a whirlwind of joy. Classmates and neighbors filled the mansion, their laughter echoing as they raced through the bounce house and played tag in the sprawling lawn. Thomas manned the grill, flipping burgers with a focus that belied his inexperience, while Clara organized games, her stern demeanor melting as she pinned the tail on a donkey. Jalen, the social spark, led a group in a water balloon fight, his giggles infectious. Darius, quieter, sat under a tree with a few friends, sketching superheroes for them, but Thomas noticed him glance at the festivities, a flicker of engagement in his eyes. As the sun dipped, casting a warm glow over the backyard, Thomas called everyone to the dining room, where the chocolate cake stood proudly, its lopsided layers a testament to his effort. 7 candles flickered, their light dancing on the boys' faces. The crowd sang, Happy Birthday, and Thomas's throat tightened, Emily's absence a palpable ache. Jalen and Darius leaned forward, blowing out the candles together, their wishes unspoken but heavy in the air. Best cake ever, Jalen declared, diving into his slice, chocolate smearing his chin. Darius took a bite, his expression unreadable, but he murmured, It's like Mom's. The words hit Thomas like a wave, a bittersweet victory. After cake, Thomas handed out gifts, a soccer jersey with Jalen's favorite player's number, a professional art set for Darius, complete with watercolors and brushes. Jalen whooped, pulling the jersey over his shirt, while Darius traced the art set's case, his fingers lingering on the embossed label. Thanks, Mr. Thomas, he said, his voice soft but deliberate. Thomas's heart swelled, but he kept his smile steady, not wanting to overwhelm the moment. As the party wound down, he gathered the boys for one final gift, his hands trembling as he placed a wrapped package on the table. This is special, he said, his voice thick. Something your mom would have wanted you to have. Jalen tore into the wrapping, revealing a photo album, its leather cover embossed with their initials. Clara had helped compile it, filling it with pictures of Emily, smiling at the beach, reading to the boys, cheering at their soccer games. The last pages held newer photos. Thomas with Jalen at a game, Darius sketching at the mansion, the three of them at a park. Jalen's eyes sparkled, pointing out a picture of Emily laughing. "She was so pretty," he said, his voice small. Darius's fingers froze on a photo of Emily holding them as toddlers, his eyes glistening. "She'd like this," he said quietly, looking at Thomas. "She'd like you to be here." The words unlocked something in Thomas, tears pricking his eyes. He cleared his throat, kneeling beside them. "I'm here for good," he said, his voice raw. "I promise." Jalen grinned, leaning into him, but Darius hesitated, his gaze searching Thomas's face. Then in a voice so soft it was nearly lost in the party's hum, he said, "Thanks, Dad." The word, simple, monumental, stopped Thomas's heart, then set it racing. Jalen, catching the moment, echoed, "Yeah, Dad," his voice bright. Clara, standing nearby, wiped a tear, her smile a rare gift. The party ended with kids trailing out, clutching goodie bags as the backyard grew quiet. Thomas walked the boys to their bunk beds, the mansion now a home in ways it had never been. Jalen fell asleep mid-sentence, clutching his jersey while Darius lay awake, staring at the ceiling. "You meant it, right?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "About staying?" Thomas sat on the floor, his heart laid bare. "Every word," he said. "I'm your dad, Darius, and I'm not going anywhere." Darius nodded, his eyes closing, a fragile trust taking root. As Thomas turned off the light, the photo album lay open on the desk, Emily's smile a quiet blessing. The rose from her casket, pressed in his study, was a reminder of the love he'd lost and the sons he'd found. The party had been a triumph, but the true victory was in Darius's whispered dad, a bridge across years of absence. Outside, the stars glittered over D.C., and Thomas felt for the first time like a father. Not perfect, but present, bound by a promise to make every birthday, every moment, count. The road ahead would test them, but tonight, in the quiet of his son's room, Thomas knew they were becoming a family, one fragile, beautiful step at a time. The summer sun hung high over Oakwood Cemetery in Willow Creek, Virginia, bathing the rolling hills in a warm, golden light that softened the edges of grief. 9 months had passed since Thomas Reed first stood at Emily Carter's grave, his heart shattered by her loss in the discovery of his twin sons, Jalen and Darius. Today he returned, not as a stranger haunted by regret, but as a father, flanked by the boys who had become his world. The cemetery, once barren and cold, now bloomed with wildflowers, their vibrant colors a quiet testament to time's healing touch. Jalen, 7 years old and brimming with energy, clutched a white rose, Emily's favorite, his curls catching the breeze. Darius, ever the quieter twin, held his rose with care, his sketch pad tucked under his arm, his dark eyes reflecting a depth beyond his years. Behind them, Clara, their guardian-turned-grandmother figure, walked with a steady grace, her presence a bridge between past and present. The journey to this moment had been arduous, a tapestry of small victories and lingering wounds. Since the boy's 7th birthday, when Darius's whispered dad had cracked open a door to trust, Thomas had reshaped his life around them. His D.C. mansion, once a sterile showcase of wealth, now bore the chaos of family. Soccer balls in the foyer, Darius's sketches taped to the fridge, Jalen's superhero posters brightening the walls. He delegated most of his tech empire's duties, trading boardroom battles for school pickups and bedtime stories. The boys lived with him during the week, spending weekends with Clara, whose cottage remained a haven of stability. Today, they'd come to honor Emily, to share their new life with the mother who'd given them everything, and to forge a future from the ashes of loss. The trio reached Emily's headstone, its marble gleaming under the sun, etched with her name and the words, "Beloved Mother, forever in our hearts." Jalen knelt first, placing his rose at the base, his fingers brushing the stone as if it were her hand. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice bright but tinged with longing. "We miss you, but we're doing okay. Dad's got this huge house, and I scored 3 goals last week." His chatter, so like Emily's warmth, brought a smile to Thomas's lips, though his throat tightened. Darius stepped forward next, his rose joining Jalen's, his touch deliberate, almost reverent. He stood silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the stone, then spoke softly. "I drew you something," he said, pulling a sketch from his pad. A portrait of Emily, her smile captured in charcoal, radiant against a backdrop of stars. He tucked it under the roses, a gift from a son who'd carried her memory in every line he drew. Thomas knelt last, his rose completing the trio, its petals vivid against the marble. "Thank you, Emily," he whispered, too quiet for the boys to hear. "For them, for everything." The guilt that had once consumed him had dulled, replaced by a fierce gratitude for the sons she'd raised alone and the chance to be their father now. He stood, his hand resting lightly on Jalen's shoulder, his eyes meeting Darius's, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they'd built. Clara, a few steps back, wiped a tear, her stern facade softened by the scene. "She'd be proud," she said, her voice steady but warm. "All 3 of you." The words stirred something in Darius, who glanced at Thomas, his expression open in a way it hadn't been months ago. "I think Mom's happy we're together," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "She'd like seeing us like this." The statement, coming from the boy who'd once fled in anger at Thomas's revelation, was a benediction. Thomas's chest tightened, emotion threatening to spill over. "I hope so," he said, his voice thick. Darius nodded, then added, "She wrote about you, you know, in her letters to us, said you were a good man who got lost for a while." The revelation hit Thomas like a wave, Emily's lingering faith in him a gift he hadn't expected. "I was lost," he admitted, his gaze encompassing both boys. "But you 2 found me." Jalen, sensing the weight of the moment, tugged at Thomas's hand. "Can we tell Mom about the science fair? I won 2nd place." His enthusiasm broke the tension, and Thomas chuckled, nodding. As Jalen launched into a story about his volcano project, Darius joined in, describing how he'd helped with the poster, their voices weaving together in a harmony that filled the quiet cemetery. Thomas listened, marveling at their resilience, their ability to carry joy alongside grief. They were Emily's sons, but they were his too, a blend of her strength and his newfound devotion. Clara stepped closer, her hand resting on Darius's shoulder. "Emily believed in second chances," she said, her eyes meeting Thomas's. "She'd be proud of the family you're building." The words were a balm, easing the last remnants of Thomas's fear that he could never atone for his absence. He'd missed 6 years, but the past 9 months had been a testament to what love and persistence could forge. He'd attended every soccer game, helped with homework, and learned to braid Jalen's curls under Clara's watchful eye. The mansion was no longer a museum but a home, its walls echoing with the boys' laughter and the occasional bickering of brothers. As they turned to leave, Jalen ran ahead, chasing a butterfly through the wildflowers, his energy boundless. Darius fell into step beside Thomas, closer than he'd ever walked before, his sketch pad swinging lightly. "Dad," he said, the word now natural, a quiet anchor. "I'm glad you found us." The simplicity of it, from a boy who'd once guarded his heart so fiercely, nearly undid Thomas. He looked at his son, seeing Emily in the curve of his smile, himself in the depth of his eyes, and felt a love so powerful it stole his breath. "I'm glad too," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion. "More than you'll ever know." They reached the cemetery gates, where Clara's car waited alongside Thomas's Bentley. Jalen doubled back, grabbing Thomas's other hand, and the 3 of them linked as they walked into the sunlight. "We promised Clara dinner at her place," Jalen reminded them, his grin mischievous. "She's making fried chicken." Darius rolled his eyes but smiled, a rare lightness in his expression. Thomas laughed, the sound mingling with the breeze, a melody of family forged through pain but bound by hope. As they drove back to Willow Creek, the town's familiar streets unfolding before them, Thomas glanced at the boys in the rearview mirror, Jalen singing off-key, Darius sketching the passing trees. The pressed rose from Emily's casket, now a bookmark in his study, was a quiet reminder of the journey that had brought them here. The mansion awaited, filled with their chaos, their dreams, their future. Thomas Reed, once a man defined by ambition, was now a father, his empire secondary to the family he'd vowed to nurture. The road ahead would hold challenges, but as the sun dipped behind the oaks, casting long shadows, Thomas knew they'd face them together. A family not perfect but whole, their love a promise that would endure. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey with Thomas, Jalen, and Darius, a story of loss, redemption, and the unbreakable bonds of family. We hope their tale touched your heart as much as it did ours. Please share your thoughts below. What moved you most? How do you feel about their new beginning? Let us know where you're tuning in from, and until next time, keep believing in the power of second chances. See you soon.